Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into ancient Germany today.
Really stepping back in time.
And, we'll be looking at them through the lens of Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Gibbon.
Exactly. And, what made these Germanic tribes such formidable opponents to the mighty Roman Empire?
What did Gibbon see?
That's what we're going to explore. And he kicks things off with a description of Germany that might surprise you.
Oh.
It was a much colder climate than what Germany experiences today.
How much colder?
Think reindeer roaming around. He even compares it to modern-day Canada.
Wow. Rivers freezing over.
Absolutely. Rivers like the Rhine and the Danube completely frozen.
That's wild. So what did Gibbon make of this stark difference?
Well, he believed this harsh climate actually shaped the Germans.
How so?
It made them physically tough, incredibly brave.
Ah, I see. Forged in the cold. The Romans must have been quite intimidated.
I'd imagine so. Coming from a milder climate, encountering these northerners.
Had to be a shock.
But Gibbon doesn't stop at the climate. He delves into their origins.
Right. Where did they come from?
And this is where his critical thinking really stands out.
He was known for that.
He casts a skeptical eye on the idea of tracing the Germans back to Noah's Ark.
Ah, a popular notion at the time.
It was. But Gibbon advocates for a more evidence-based approach.
Good for him.
And he makes a key point. During the time of Tacitus, the Roman historian,
Tacitus, yes.
the Germans didn't have a written language.
Interesting. So no written records.
None whatsoever, relying heavily on oral tradition.
How did that shape their development?
Well, without written records, their history, literature, even formal education was limited.
That makes their achievements even more remarkable, doesn't it?
It really does, especially in warfare.
They had to be resourceful, adaptable.
Absolutely. Speaking of resourcefulness, Gibbon goes on to describe their lifestyle, their economy.
What was it like?
Picture this. They lived in simple circular huts.
Basic dwellings.
Made of timber and straw. Quite a contrast to Roman architecture.
I can imagine.
And their economy revolved around hunting, herding, and some limited agriculture.
Simple, basic necessities.
And resources, well, those were scarce. Gold, silver, even iron was hard to come by.
Did that impact their weaponry?
It did. Their weapons weren't as sophisticated as the Roman legions.
Makes sense.
They often relied on barter instead of a money-based economy.
Interesting. Different priorities altogether.
Right. Not driven by economic pursuits in the same way. Warfare held a greater allure.
The pursuit of glory.
Exactly. And, their values were really reflected in their social structure.
And what was that like?
Surprisingly, it wasn't as rigid as you might think for a warrior culture.
Oh.
Gibbon describes a system with democratic elements.
Tell me more.
They had tribal assemblies where they made key decisions, including whether to go to war.
So not just a chieftain calling the shots?
No, not at all. The chieftain's authority came from the respect and loyalty of their warriors.
Companions, as they were called.
Yes, companions. These warriors willingly followed them into battle.
It was a bond of loyalty. Shared ambition.
Absolutely. A thirst for adventure, too, you could say.
And what about the women in German society? Did Gibbon mention them?
He did, and he highlighted their high status. Very different from Roman society.
How so?
He described their involvement in warfare, their courage, the importance of chastity, all highly valued traits.
Suggesting a more egalitarian social structure.
It seems so. They really defied that stereotypical image of barbarians.
But of course, warfare did play a huge role in their lives.
Oh, absolutely. Their military practices were just as fascinating as their social structure.
Tell me about it.
Imagine these warriors charging into battle, but without the discipline of the Roman legions.
Without the heavy armor.
Exactly. Gibbon describes their fighting style as fierce, but often lacking tactical discipline.
They poured all their energy into the initial attack.
They did, which could be incredibly intimidating. But if that first wave failed...
Not as adept at regrouping.
No. And this is where their internal divisions played a significant role.
Right, the different tribes.
Despite a shared culture, they were often in conflict with each other.
Preventing a unified front.
Precisely. Gibbon points out that these frequent conflicts prevented them from challenging Rome for a long period.
And the Romans knew how to exploit that, didn't they?
Oh, they did. Masters of strategy and diplomacy. Divide and conquer in action.
Fascinating how those political maneuvers can be just as effective as brute force.
It really is. It highlights the complex interplay of factors at play, even back then. But even with their internal conflicts, they still posed a threat.
Especially as Rome itself began to weaken.
Exactly. Gibbon emphasizes this point. He notes that if the Germanic tribes had been unified,
Imagine that.
they could have assembled an army of 1,000,000 warriors.
1,000,000. That's staggering.
It is. No wonder the Romans were wary. But let's circle back to this idea of them being labeled barbarians.
Right. Gibbon seems to paint a much more nuanced picture.
He does. He acknowledges their lack of what we might consider traditional markers of civilization.
Like a written language, for example.
Yes, things like that.
Yeah.
But he also recognizes the inherent strengths of their culture,
Such as
their fierce independence, strong sense of community, unwavering loyalty.
qualities that perhaps the Romans even came to envy.
As their own society grew more decadent, perhaps,
Yeah.
it makes you question our assumptions about what defines civilization, doesn't it?
It does. History is rarely a simple clash between good and evil.
It's a tapestry woven from diverse cultures, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. What else struck you about Gibbon's account?
You know, his description of their relationship with nature really stood out to me.
In what way?
They were so closely intertwined with their environment, drawing sustenance and inspiration from it,
Such a contrast to the Romans' increasing urbanization.
isn't it? The Germans represent a more primal connection to the natural world.
Something that resonates even today as we navigate our own relationship with the environment.
It does, doesn't it? And let's not forget the bards.
The poet warriors.
Yes, chronicling the deeds of heroes, fueling the Germans' desire for glory.
Imagine the power of their words, echoing through the forests, stirring the hearts of warriors.
I can only imagine. They were the keepers of their history, their cultural identity.
A living link to their past. History isn't just about dates and battles, is it?
No, it's about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are.
Exactly. And those stories, as Gibbon shows us, can shape the course of empires. So after this deep dive into Gibbon's portrayal, what stands out to you?
Well, for me, it's the realization that the Germans, despite their lack of what we might typically consider advanced civilization,
They possessed a unique set of strengths.
they did. Their physical hardiness, their warrior culture, their strong sense of community
And those strengths, combined with Rome's gradual decline,
allowed them to play a pivotal role in shaping European history,
it's a reminder that power dynamics can shift.
and that seemingly barbaric cultures can rise when the conditions are right.
Gibbon really emphasizes the importance of understanding history from multiple perspectives.
Not just through the lens of the dominant power, by giving us this glimpse into the world of the ancient Germans.
He challenges us to reevaluate our notions of progress and civilization.
He shows us that history isn't a straight line towards some preordained goal.
But a much more complex and unpredictable journey.
And that unpredictability is what makes it so fascinating to explore. It makes you wonder about all the what-ifs.
Such as?
What if the Germanic tribes had been more unified? What if they had developed a written language earlier?
Intriguing questions. A more unified Germania might have posed an even greater challenge to Rome.
And a written language might have led to different cultural and technological developments.
Fascinating to consider how those seemingly small differences could have had such a large impact.
Those what-ifs are really tantalizing, aren't they?
They are. History is full of them.
But, going back to something we touched on earlier, their connection with nature.
Right. It was central to their way of life, wasn't it?
They weren't just living in nature. They were living with it.
Drawing sustenance and inspiration from their surroundings.
And you mentioned the contrast with the Romans. Their increasing urbanization, reliance on infrastructure,
It's almost like the Germans saw themselves as a part of nature.
not separate from it.
Exactly. And I think this perspective really shaped their worldview, their values.
In what way?
Well, for example, their reverence for the gods, their belief in a glorious afterlife, all tied to bravery in battle, deeply intertwined with nature,
Their beliefs were a reflection of their environment,
a way of making sense of the world around them.
and those beliefs fueling their courage, their willingness to face danger.
It's interesting, isn't it, how belief systems, religious or secular, can be such powerful forces.
Shaping history.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Climate, social structure, military practices, beliefs.
Gibbon presents a multifaceted view.
We can't just reduce them to the label of barbarians.
No, their story is far more complex than that. And it reminds us that we should always try to understand historical figures and cultures within their own context.
Not through our modern lens.
Exactly. Now, I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier, the bards.
Yes.
You described them as poet warriors, keeping history alive through stories and songs.
It sounds almost mythical, doesn't it?
It does, but it speaks to the power of storytelling.
Doesn't it? They weren't just entertainers, they were the keepers of their cultural memory.
Preserving their history, their values, their heroes.
All through oral tradition.
Can you imagine sitting around a fire listening to these bards weave tales of bravery and adventure?
It must have been incredibly powerful.
Especially for young warriors, eager to prove themselves.
The impact those stories had, shaping their aspirations, their sense of identity.
It's a reminder that history isn't just facts and dates.
It's a tapestry woven from stories, connecting us to the past, shaping our understanding of who we are.
And the ancient Germans, as we've seen, they have a rich story.
Full of triumphs and struggles.
They weren't a monolithic group, were they?
No, they were diverse tribes, each with their own customs and beliefs.
But they shared certain core values.
They did. Love of freedom, a warrior spirit, a connection to nature.
Those values shaped their destiny and ultimately played a role in shaping Europe.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how these tribes, once seen as a threat to Rome,
Became part of its legacy.
their culture and traditions blending with those of the Romans, contributing to the melting pot of European identity.
History is constantly evolving,
Cultures clash, blend, and transform over time.
creating something new.
And the ancient Germans are a testament to this dynamic process.
So as we wrap up this part of our dive into Gibbon's portrayal, what's the most important thing you hope our listener takes away?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. We should approach history with an open mind.
A willingness to challenge our assumptions.
The ancient Germans, often depicted as simple barbarians, were complex, fascinating. Their legacy continues to influence us today.
Their story reminds us to look beyond simplistic labels
To appreciate the complexity of history.
and the importance of understanding different cultures and perspectives on their own terms.
Absolutely.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Exploring the world of the ancient Germans. Through Gibbon's eyes, of course.
It has. A real eye-opener.
Before we wrap up, I'd love to get your take on one more thing. What does their story, their experience, tell us about resilience? Adaptability? They face so many challenges, a harsh climate, internal conflicts, and yet they not only survived, but thrived, left a mark on history.
It's truly remarkable, isn't it, that resilience. They didn't have the advantages of the Romans, but they worked with what they had, adapted to their environment, forged strong communities, developed a warrior culture that allowed them to stand up to a powerful empire.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Maybe that challenging environment actually played a part in shaping that resilience.
Perhaps it did.
Would they have been the same? So fierce, so resourceful, if they'd had a milder climate, more fertile land.
That's a thought-provoking question. Maybe those harsh surroundings forced them to be more adaptable, more innovative.
They had to rely on their courage, their wits, to survive.
A real testament to the human spirit, overcoming adversity.
It reminds us that what we see as disadvantages
Can sometimes be strengths.
in disguise,
Right.
like their lack of a written language.
Right.
It meant they had to rely on oral tradition,
Hmm.
which fostered a strong sense of community, shared identity.
A powerful force. That shared history, those values passed down through generations.
And it shows the importance of storytelling.
In shaping who we are, how we see the world.
So, as we bring our deep dive to a close, what's the one thing you want our listener to walk away with from this exploration of ancient Germany?
I'd say a deeper appreciation for the complexity of history and the importance of looking beyond those simple labels. The ancient Germans, often called barbarians,
A multifaceted people.
with their own unique strengths, beliefs, aspirations.
Their story reminds us to approach history with curiosity, an open mind,
Seeking to understand different cultures and perspectives on their own terms.
and to reflect on how those cultures and perspectives have shaped our world, even the ones that seem so far removed.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into ancient Germany. It's been a pleasure exploring this fascinating chapter of history with you. We hope you'll join us again next time for another deep dive.